Good morning, good afternoon, or evening. Welcome to this episode of SMB Live Rewind, where we're going to focus on hybrid identity and the opportunity that you have to help your customers from an on prem or cloud for access and secure access and management of those identities. My name is Matt Hester. I'm a senior partner technology strategist out of the South Central area. And in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the opportunities around identity. And I'm telling you what, folks, if you have customers that are in Office 365 today, you have a big leg up on what you can do with that identity. And just using Azure Active Directory and some of the abilities behind it really opened up a world of security, not only for you as a partner, but also for your customers. And we're going to talk about some of the technologies behind it. When you think about this, what is driving all of the need around identity? Well, 61% of the workers in the world today mix work and life on the devices. 80% of those workers actually do a lot of non-approved SaaS applications. And more scary to this point is 70% of network intrusions happen because of weak or exploited credentials. Think about that. Identities are not only the key to gaining access to how we can do all these wonderful things, but it's also how hackers can exploit those environments and how vulnerabilities can be found inside the world today. So we're going to talk about how we can work with some of those things inside of Azure Active Directory and some of the benefits that we have with that as well. And really, when you think about this, not only do they have those statistics, what are driving those numbers? And it all boils down to we have employees using different devices, different apps, and different data, business partners, customers, and IT has to try to manage all of this. And really, this gets really messy, especially when we have BYOD inside of our infrastructure. How do we protect that? And how do we work with it? I would recommend you check out the SMB Live Rewind episodes on EMS, or our Enterprise Mobility Suite, that shows the other half of this story. But on this one, we're going to focus just on that identity. And when you think about it, it's really a mess. We have all our on-prem devices and apps. We have our managed devices, and then we have our Windows Server and our private cloud with Active Directory. How do we tie into all the different apps that are out there, from Salesforce to 365 to Box to Dropbox to SAP to Concur? We have all kinds of things. It's a bit of a mess, but it doesn't have to be. And more importantly, how do your customers handle this? How do we log in securely from those managed devices, those on-prem devices, to those actual environments? And it really is at the core of everything that we do, from not only enterprise mobility, but from identity management. It's at the center of everything we do. And it's been the center for a while. If you think about the on-prem environments that we work and live in today, Active Directory or other directory services, although Active Directory is predominantly the choice for most customers in the world today, really is where we start. Whenever you build any infrastructure, you have to have that Active Directory in place for security and for identity. But now what about the cloud? The cloud introduces all kinds of interesting challenges, and what kind of apps we have, from Office 365 to the many other SaaS apps to Azure, has all these different things. Well, how do we bring them together? And that's where Azure Active Directory plays a key role. Now, be very clear on this. Azure Active Directory is not the same as Active Directory on-prem. You can't extend the schema like we can on-prem. Currently, it's just identity and access management. If you want to do more things like group policy, maybe you have some managed services group policy. Well, guess what? For those customers, you're still going to have an Active Directory server on-prem to currently do that. Now, I know down the road, hopefully, Azure Active Directory will get some additional services on top of it. And currently, one's in preview called the domain services, the Azure Active Directory domain services, which is making Azure Active Directory, giving it that extensibility to act it more like a traditional AD environment that we have. But the nice thing about this, with that Azure Active Directory, it provides a great way for us to synchronize our on-prem IDs and pass those directly to the cloud technologies with just a very simple connection. The DirSync tools that we've had in the past, and the new tool, the Azure Active Directory Connect tool, really does a fantastic job of making this easy to do, to get those directories in synchronization. And more importantly, because we're in Azure Active Directory, we can then set up single sign-on or same sign-on to the other directory structures that we might have, those different applications inside of it. And we can even offer self-service capabilities down to our users for identity. We can offer self-service password reset so they don't have to call you. But once again, it all depends. If a customer doesn't want self-service and they want those phone calls, you can certainly do that as well. But really, identity is at the core of all of this. And when you think about the world we live today, which spans both on-prem environments and cloud, Azure Active Directory becomes a very core part of this. Now, I mentioned Office 365. Well, remember, where does Office 365 store its accounts? Inside of Azure Active Directory. So you have a leg up if you've already done some of this work, and now it's just a matter of extending your services to those customers and enabling things like multi-factor authentication and other technologies to really help improve this. When you look at Azure Active Directory, it's an identity management. It's identity as a service, essentially. There is just tons of objects, tons of authentications done inside of Azure Active Directory. There's over 7 million directories in the world today, over 1 trillion authentications since the release, and about 1 billion authentications every day on Azure AD. Now, some of that could be 365 and some of that could just be pure Azure. But understand that Azure Active Directory is rapidly growing and rapidly maturing, not only for Microsoft, but for your business and for your customers as well. So when you look at our directory solutions moving forward, Azure Active Directory really is the identity management framework of the choice. And really, what does identities allow you to do? It allows you to unify your environment. Basically, everybody gets one user and one ID, and we can actually have that set up so no matter where they go, that's the only ID they have. More importantly, with that identity in place, now we can bring our device. And when you focus away from, oh, I have to worry about all the devices in here and I have to worry versus worrying about that identity, you get some rich capabilities that now all you have to worry about is that when I log on to my Windows device versus my Android device versus my Mac versus my iOS device, the only thing it changes is the form factor, and the identity is key to all of that. It's also how we protect the data. It's how we set up encryption for that data. It's how we set up multi-factor authentication. So instead of just having a user ID and password, we have to either get a text message or a phone call and validate that way. That's a great way to keep your environment secure. And in part two of this SMB Live Rewind, I'll actually show you some of those things and how to set up multi-factor authentication, as well as a few other things as well. More importantly, when you're working with those applications and you're discovering all those different SaaS applications that employees have, once we know what they're there, we then can use Azure Active Directory to facilitate that same sign-on and help from an IT standpoint manage that. Azure Active Directory provides lots of scenarios from single sign-on to making life of users and IT easier, better to manage. We can do a lot of things. You're basically your on-prem domain controller becomes a service that we can connect to the Azure Active Directory and enables that anytime, anywhere productivity. And more importantly, it's all around identity-driven security, making sure we keep those user IDs and passwords safe and secure. And when we talk about thousands of apps and thousand identities, a big part of that story is right here. We had connect, sync, and premises on-prem to Active Directory. There's over 2,600 popular apps inside of it. And in part two, I'll show you those apps. And we can set all this up and we can publish that. We can even write apps. So if you have a customer that has their own spun app, we actually have APIs available to them to tie into Active Directory to help enable that single sign-on. Now, the nice thing about Azure AD synchronization is that we've really improved this. I mean, DirSync is a legacy tool. Used to be the FIM connector. FIM connector is no longer developed, and DirSync is legacy, and it's not going to be updated. It hasn't been updated for quite some time. The new tool is Azure AD Connect, and that is true management tool that we have. It does all the deployment. It does filtering of OUs. It does password writebacks if you want to. It replaces a lot of some of the ADF components we had to have in place for prior deployments. And really, it's a much more robust tool. It just flat out works. I've had very good success. And once again, in part two, we'll take a look at AD Connect. Now, what do these scenarios enable you? Once you start synchronizing your directories, we talked about single sign-on and same sign-on. Both are SSO, but both are slightly different. So when we have our environments and we're just doing password synchronization, we get what's called same sign-on experience. What'll happen is the user will log in the morning with their same user ID and password, and all their on-prem apps will work pretty much the same way as they do today. They'll be able to authenticate under the covers, and we get kind of single sign-on for on-prem. But when they start moving to other applications out in the cloud world today, what happens is they're going to get same sign-on, which means they're going to be prompted for those user IDs and passwords. Now, what may happen is the users, if IT is allowing the caching of credentials, may actually be able to trick out same sign-on and make it behave like single sign-on by checking that box, remember me, and they get cache credentials and they get cookies that do that. But at the end of the day, it's the same user ID and password they sign on in the morning, and even though they're using the cache credentials and they don't see that authentication box, it's actually coming up for them. and that same sign-on. Now, if you want to offer pure single sign-on to those environments, you're going to need Active Directory Federation Services or ADFS in place to make that happen. And what that'll do is that'll be pure single sign-on. In other words, you sign in once in the morning, you don't have to cache those credentials, you don't have to create cookies, you don't have to do any of that, and it's going to do all that authentication back through the Active Directory environment themselves. So it all depends on what you want to do. From an SMB standpoint, generally, I see folks fall in the top section. They just do that basic synchronization and same sign-on and leveraging cookies and credentials to kind of get that pseudo single sign-on experience is generally fairly cost-effective for them to work with. Now, when we take a look at this, identity is really the cornerstone. It's not only the key to how we can manage it and offer secure solutions and do things like multi-factor authentication, it enables things like EMS, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication. There's a lot of great things you can do. The great thing about this is if you already have folks inside of Office 365 today, you already have that identity inside of Azure Active Directory, and it's going to be fairly easy for you to offer some of those additional services as a part of your managed services to those customers to extend what we can do with that identity to help secure them, give them more flexibility. It really depends on what you want to do. So that identity is key to a lot of things. And lastly, in part two of this series, we'll talk about Azure AD Connect. It is the one tool to do it all, and we'll take a look at what the improvements are. And if you haven't seen the tool, if you're still using DirSync, hopefully you'll like the improvements with that. So thank you for watching this episode of SMB Live Rewind, where we focused on the key concepts behind hybrid identity.